Here we are up in my wood, and these are the trees which will be partly producing not this winter's logs but next winter's logs, because with logs you always have to keep at least a year ahead. This is part of the woodland. It's about 1/4 of an acre, which is less than 1/8 of a hectare, and that provides 90% of the heating for the house. We're now up in the upper woodshed, which is a small shed which I use for various purposes, but principally in the winter, after I've felled the trees, I bring them into this small woodshed in pieces, usually about this size or a little bit bigger. I do most of the sawing up here. As you can see, a saw this size, perfectly adequate. This is a 750mm saw, and I will saw a log like that into 4 separate pieces. Keep it relatively short, makes it much easier to split. I will then split them, and you can see behind where they're all stacked up. So this amount of wood here, going right back about 3 meters behind what you can see, is a very large stack, and each winter I will fill this, as well as most of the other main woodshed area. But this is a particularly useful small shed, because when it's raining I don't want to be climbing trees too much. Gets the equipment dirty and rusty, wet. So I come in here, it faces east and therefore we don't get much rain in here. This open area, not too sweaty, because her in charge doesn't like me getting too sweaty, and I can do most of my sawing quite happily in this covered area. I use it for other purposes as well, and later in the winter you'll be able to see the way in which I use a piece of equipment I invented myself. I use these ladders tied up right at tight to the tree, and this piece of equipment enables me to climb quite happily up to 40, 50, 60 feet. That's about up to 20 meters high, as some of the trees are. The ladder itself is arranged so that these bolts at the back bite into the trunk of the tree, into the bark, and stop it slipping. I put a big strap around the top and the bottom of each ladder, and then I can stack the ladders one above the other as I work up and then coming down the tree. You'll see that. We'll do a video on that probably in November, maybe late October, after the leaves have come off and I start felling some of the trees. As I've mentioned before, 2 or 3 trees each year, sometimes 4 or 5 depending on the size, will be felled per season. That will be either coppiced or pollarded, but I keep my coppicing fairly high so that the rabbits don't nibble at new shoots the following spring. And my foot will be resting on there, one on each side. That gives me enough purchase and ability to use my large saws up the tree to fell it about 1.5 meters long each time. So I can work down the tree, taking off approximately 1.5 meters per step. This of course is after I've felled the main amount of the branches which are right up at the top of the trees. Now that I've come up to the top woodshed, I might as well take a load down. This is the double wheeled barrow that we looked at earlier, and this is the one that saves me most of the time, ending up on my backside. Remember that this is a considerable slope on this site. The grass hasn't been cut recently because it's been too wet, and it'll be due for its last cutting very soon. Right, that should do it. What we talked about last week was the use of blocks, concrete blocks, which were used in a way which would make them a very long-term proposition. I use them for steps, I use them for various things, like foundations to buildings and so on. It is important to dramatically reduce the amount of concrete and therefore the cement which is used in the concrete, because cement is a very carbon intensive industry. Other ways to use similar materials, as you've seen just now, is down below me the way I use slabs, concrete slabs, again without any mortar or concrete fixing them in place, to make raised beds for my raised bed system. This is a no-dig long-term system. These can be reused by somebody in 20, 50, 100 years time for another purpose if they want to. But what you can see now is firstly the concrete slabs which are on the edges. They contain the soil and the compost. In this case I've got new compost here which I will be putting onto the beds so that the beds will be put to bed for the winter. It's now the middle of September, so that will be spread out shortly and covered over. I'll give you more details about that next week probably. But also here in shot you can see onions which came out of this bed. I put a small cover over them. They're in a wire tray. They will dry out perfectly well in there, and then I will put them into store after they've had a couple of weeks in this system. One other way in which you can make small outbuildings using timber principally as the main building material. Another way to do it which uses a minimum of concrete for the foundations. Remember, it's a mistake to put wood into the ground if you can avoid it, because it won't last very long. 20 years would be a long time for most timbers unless you use very high quality thick oak, which is difficult to get hold of and extremely expensive. But another way which I've developed is this, which is a small amount of concrete, galvanized gate hinge, and I set the galvanized gate hinge into the concrete, dig a hole in the ground, bolt the timber upright to it here. That then provides a really stable fixing for effectively the same thing as putting the post straight into the ground. This again is a reusable piece of equipment which, when the building falls down in 200 years time, somebody can carry on using that for the same purpose again. It pays to put the hinge this way up, because here there is a large hole which you can use to put a big bolt straight through onto the upright timbers, which can be bolted straight onto there. And there's one hole there, one large screw can go into that, long term, will last for years, minimum carbon, minimum cement.